Okay, let's unpack this. What really happens to a political movement when its defining figure isn't right there at the forefront anymore?
It's a huge question.
Yeah, a fascinating one. And it's pretty much the core of our deep dive today. We're tackling what a post-Trump Republican Party might look like, who's lining up to potentially lead it, and the core ideas, the dynamics really shaping its future.
That's right. And to get a handle on this evolving landscape, we've been digging into quite a stack of sources.
What kind of stuff?
Well, recent news reports looking at potential successors, some research that tries to, define this movement often called Trumpism, and even checking out public discussion forums just to see what people are actually saying.
Okay. So, our mission is, well, pretty straightforward. Pull out the key insights, the surprising bits from all this to give you a clearer picture of this really dynamic political moment. Let's jump in.
Yeah, what's immediately striking, I think, from the sources is how fast the focus is already kind of shifting to what's next.
Right. Even while things are still playing out now.
Exactly. The 2028 election, it's already being described as an unmistakable undercurrent in, recent political talk.
Absolutely. And you can already see potential contenders making, well, noticeable moves. The sources really highlight a recent conservative gathering. It was American Compass's New World Gala back on June 3rd, 2025. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio were key speakers there.
And those two, they're specifically pointed out in the sources as individuals who hope to carry that Trump legacy forward.
Interesting.
And what's also interesting is President Trump himself has reportedly called them good successors. So there's that potential nod.
Okay, so if we look at the numbers right now, the ones we saw, who's kind of leading the pack?
Well, there was a May poll by JL Partners. It gives us a snapshot, right? A potential 2028 Republican primary field.
Yeah.
And it showed J.D. Vance as the clear favorite. Pretty significant lead, 46% support among the Republicans they polled.
Wow, 46%. That's quite a margin this early out. Who else was in there?
Yeah, it is. For context, others were Ron DeSantis at 8%, Vivek Ramaswamy at 7%, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz both got 6%, and Nikki Haley was at 5%.
Did the sources give any clue why Vance is polling so much higher? Is it just the VP title?
Well, the sources seem to connect it back to exactly his role as vice president, plus his, consistent alignment with the core ideas and the style of the Trump presidency.
Okay.
So for many of the polled Republicans, he's seen as the sort of natural heir, and his current position validates that,
Right. Now, it's important we should point out that poll did not include Donald Trump himself.
Yeah.
He's term limited in January 2029. That's the 22nd Amendment.
Which raises, a really important question about the future, doesn't it? Because while the Constitution is, it seems pretty clear on term limits, sources do mention that President Trump has, hinted at trying to run for a third term.
Which would be against the Constitution.
Directly against it, yeah.
And we even saw some chatter, didn't we, in a discussion forum about potential constitutional loopholes.
Oh, yeah, like the idea of running for vice president with the intention of the president immediately resigning, that kind of thing.
Wild speculation.
Totally. And the sources are quick to shoot that down. They describe those ideas as, improbable, maybe a constitutional gray area at best, or just based on a, frankly, poorly written amendment. It's not seen as likely, politically or legally.
Okay, sticking with Vance for a second, though, there's that fascinating bit in the sources about his background, his evolution.
Yeah,
He's only 40, right?
Yeah.
And back in 2016, he was highly critical of Trump. I mean, reportedly called him America's Hitler.
That's right. Pretty strong words. Yet, in what the sources call a full 360-degree turn, he later became one of Trump's most vocal, most loyal aides.
Quite the pivot.
A huge pivot. And that loyalty, the sources imply, was absolutely key to his rapid rise. Getting appointed vice president only 2 years after being elected senator for the first time.
Yeah, that was fast.
Very fast. And some sources noted it was seen as a surprise, given how short his political career was up to that point. It really underscores the premium put on loyalty in that political orbit.
So, speaking of the movement itself, let's pivot to what these potential successors are actually saying about the future, the vision. That American Compass event seems like a good preview.
Yeah, it does. The key themes that both Vance and Rubio hit on, they revolved around reindustrialization.
Okay.
An America First approach applying to both the economy and foreign policy, and a focus on the important role the next generation has to play in carrying all this forward.
And they shared a pretty sharp critique of the let's say, the pre-Trump establishment, right?
Oh, yeah. They basically argued it didn't focus enough on the needs of the American middle class and that it really, really neglected the country's manufacturing sector.
And they see some serious consequences from that neglect.
Definitely. Even national security consequences. Leaving the country reliant on, foreign adversaries. Rubio had a powerful quote on this that jumped out from the sources.
What was it?
He said, national security requires the ability to feed your people, and unless you're able to make the things that your economy needs in order to function and ultimately to defend yourself, pretty direct.
Very direct.
Yeah.
And Vance, he linked this perceived failure directly to Trump's rise.
He did. He said flat out, it's why Trump was elected. Described him as the first mainstream American politician to come along and say, this isn't working.
And they weren't talking short-term fixes either, were they?
No, not at all. Both speakers really emphasized the long-term nature of this transformation they're talking about. Vance called it a 20-year project to get America back to common-sense economic policy.
20 years?
Yeah. And Rubio talked about the country being in the midst of an important and long-overdue realignment that is going to be the work of a generation.
Okay, hold on, though. Because here's where it gets, well, really interesting and shows some potential, maybe, tension. Based on the sources,
What's that?
neither Vance nor Rubio mentioned the GOP mega bill at this event.
Ah, right. The big legislative priority.
Exactly. And the sources point out this bill is described as the administration's top legislative priority. But, critically, it's seen as being at odds with the very economic populism they were just talking up at American Compass.
How so?
Well, because the bill, which apparently passed the House already, could reportedly cause millions of low-income Americans to lose health insurance, it cuts food assistance funding
Oh,
while
cool.
offering tax breaks to top earners.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that definitely clashes with the platform of American Compass and others who've been urging, raising rates on corporations and high earners to help the working class.
It's a pretty significant disconnect, isn't it?
It really is, between the stated populist vision and a major piece of current administration policy that these potential successors are ostensibly part of.
So what does that tell us about the challenge of actually turning Trumpism from this sort of movement critique into actual governing policy?
That's a huge question. It highlights a real tension there.
Yeah. So while they're laying out this vision, there's already this potential conflict on a major policy right now. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and try to dissect Trumpism itself, the broader movement these successors want to carry forward.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, really understanding the dynamics of the movement is absolutely key to understanding who might lead it and how.
So where do we start? The base.
Well, sources suggest its demographic base successfully mobilized the, quote, white disenfranchised, often described as, lower to working class European Americans who felt they were experiencing social inequality, felt left behind, and were deeply opposed to the American political establishment.
And the Never Trump movement, how did sources frame that?
Kind of the flip side, characterized as a rebellion of conservative elites against the base. That's how some sources put it.
Now, a huge theme in the sources, maybe the huge theme, is the role of emotion in media.
Absolutely central. Populist discourse, the sources note, has this emotional appeal that is key to its polarizing effects. Meaning, the movement would be, quote, unintelligible without the affective component. You have to understand the deep feelings involved. Trump is described as being just incredibly skilled at recognizing and gaining trust from people with strong emotions about perceived changes.
And this played out how? In the media.
Hugely. Sources talk about this described shift where the lines between news and entertainment just kind of collapsed.
Yeah.
And audiences maybe cared more about shock and entertainment value. They highlight this media logic the way media operates now, emphasizing personalization, a political star system, dramatization, maybe over traditional reporting.
And that fit Trump perfectly.
Perfectly, they argue. Matched his celebrity status, his reality TV way of talking.
And let's be blunt, the sources point out it was profitable too.
Oh, yeah. News media companies reportedly benefited from offering spectacle and drama, outraged discourse, especially when amplified on social media. It makes money.
There was that quote.
The CBS CEO, quote, yeah, it may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. Really stark illustration of how Trump's messaging may be aligned with financial goals for some media outlets.
And Trump himself is described how? Like a shock jock.
Yeah, a political shock jock who thrives on creating disorder in provoking outrage. That's the language used.
And his message spread effectively where?
It thrived in what sources call narrowcasting environments. Think Facebook, Twitter, places where it gets repeated virally among like-minded supporters, building these substantial information echo chambers.
Right, echo chamber.
Researchers call it group polarization, or homophily, people sticking with people like them, reinforcing beliefs. And in those spaces, the sources note, the actual truth of a piece of content is less important than whether it is shared, liked, and monetized.
Oof, that's sobering.
It is. And sources also draw this line, connecting it back to talk radio.
Like Limbaugh.
Exactly. Suggesting Trump is seen as following a blueprint of leveraging outrage that was really honed on partisan media like the Rush Limbaugh show, sharing things like media fame, over-the-top showmanship, politics as entertainment, the attacks, the nicknames, the conspiracy theories.
That's quite a package.
It is, and this raises that really interesting question about authenticity within the movement.
Right, because it seems paradoxical.
Totally. Sources offer this fascinating, maybe counterintuitive perspective. They suggest Trump's willingness to, quote, flagrantly violate established norms, and yes, sometimes that included lying, could actually boost his perceived authentic appeal for some voters.
How does that work?
Well, the idea is if you see the system as corrupt or having low political legitimacy, then someone who breaks the rules can look like a brave, authentic champion, someone speaking a deep and otherwise suppressed truth against an establishment you don't trust. Some voters reportedly preferred what they saw as his gut instincts over the carefully scripted messaging you get from traditional politicians.
So, gut over script. Authenticity through rule breaking. Okay, so that covers the media, the emotion, the authenticity. Let's shift to identity. That's another core pillar the sources hit hard.
Definitely. Opposition to transgender rights is mentioned specifically, and sources draw this link to themes around, quote, toxic masculinity.
Meaning?
Pointing to a kind of nostalgia for a time when masculine entitlement went unchallenged, maybe, and a desire among some supporters to, quote, reclaim their country, restore their rightful place in it, and retrieve their manhood. Strong language there.
Very strong. And did the sources connect this to actual support?
Yeah, endorsement of what academics call hegemonic masculinity, basically. Subscribing to those traditional dominant male ideals reportedly predicted support better than other factors in some studies cited.
Wow.
Trump's public persona in 2016 is described as embodying this, being hostile to women who didn't fit traditional roles, objectifying those who did, mocking the masculinity of his male rivals.
Even masks.
Even COVID mask aversion gets linked to this tough guy image in some analyses.
And there was that animal comparison.
Yeah, the alpha male chimpanzee comparison.
Uh-huh.
Made by researchers and observers in the sources.
Seriously.
Seriously. Looking at behaviors like charging displays, intimidating foes, rallying the base, rivals paying homage. The idea being that the audience kind of vicariously shares in this sense of dominance through his persona.
And his own view on life.
There's an attributed quote, "Man is the most vicious of all animals, and life is a series of battles ending in victory or defeat."
Intense worldview. Okay, another key identity group. Christian nationalism.
Yeah, highlighted as a really significant factor in the movement space. Sources note strong support among white evangelical Christians, especially, interestingly, non-churchgoers and Christian nationalists.
How does that manifest?
Well, rallies reportedly use symbols, rhetoric, the agenda of Christian nationalism. Trump's 2024 campaign was characterized in sources as a kind of righteous crusade against groups he identified as threats, atheists, globalists, and the Marxists, aiming to restore the U.S. as one nation under God.
And he's spoken about this.
He has been critical of perceived anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within the federal government.
What's really fascinating, too, is how this whole phenomenon isn't just American, right? The sources point to international resonance.
Absolutely. They list examples of other leaders, other movements that are likened to or maybe influenced by Trumpism.
Like who?
Like Modi in India with the whole MAGA, Make India Great Again slogan. Bolsonaro in Brazil. Milei in Argentina. An affinity noted in Nigeria. Abe in Japan was described as Trump before Trump in the analyses. Similarities with Marcos and Duterte in the Philippines. Even Putin's style gets mentioned.
So it's a global trend, or at least has global echoes.
It seems so, according to these sources. Okay, so let's try to connect all these characteristics back to that succession question and look at how different sources are interpreting Trumpism itself. Because these interpretations give us different ways to think about the challenge facing any future leader.
Okay, what kind of interpretations are out there?
Well, there are stark warnings described. Threats to democracy, a shift towards populist authoritarian role. Sources cite figures like political scientist Philip Gorski, General Mark Milley expressing these concerns.
In the F word, fascism?
That comparison comes up too, yeah.
Huh.
And sources note how interpretations have evolved. The historian Robert Paxton, for instance, reportedly changed his mind after January 6th. Felt it was necessary to use that term to really understand aspects of the movement.
Others, too.
Yeah, others discuss how certain characteristics seem to satisfy criteria outlined by thinkers like Umberto Eco, or an Argentinian historian saw intersections with historical movements like Peronism in Argentina.
Are there other, maybe more academic labels?
Sure, one analysis mentioned described it as neo-Bonapartist patrimonialism.
Okay. Well, what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, a style of leadership where power is really centered around the leader's personal authority and loyalty networks, rather than strictly following institutional rules or purely ideological lines.
Got it. Any other perspectives?
Yeah, sources mention one linking it back to patterns identified by the Frankfurt School researchers, like in that book, Prophets of Deceit. The idea there is that followers are sort of duped, their misery gets perpetuated, and it prepares them for a more illiberal form of government.
So, a lot of different ways to frame this. Heavy stuff.
Very different frames, yeah. From authoritarianism warnings to specific historical comparisons to these sociological analyses.
Okay, so looking at all these pieces, the reliance on emotion, the media spectacle, the focus on authenticity, identity, the global echoes, and these really varied, sometimes quite alarming interpretations. What does this all mean for a post-Trump movement?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. How does a movement so rooted in these deep, complex dynamics actually cohere around a new leader?
It really highlights the challenge and maybe the potential instability or tension within the movement going forward. We even saw that comment from the discussion forum, remember?
And what about 2032?
Yeah, the idea that if Republicans lose soon, they might try a more moderate approach. But if that fails, they'd immediately rush back to full-on MAGA by 2032.
Right. Shows that potential strategic back and forth, but also the underlying pull of that core base.
Exactly. The base's influence remains strong.
Okay. This deep dive into the sources, it's definitely painted a complex picture. We've looked at the potential successors, their vision, and that tension with current policy. And we've really tried to pull apart the underlying dynamics of Trumpism itself.
The emotional stuff, the media, authenticity, identity, the global links, how people are trying to interpret it.
Yeah. It really makes you consider the significant challenge ahead for anyone hoping to step into that leadership role.
Absolutely. It's not a simple inheritance.
Definitely not.
Mm.
So here's something maybe to leave you thinking about. Given this whole blend we've discussed, the policy goals, the deep cultural and emotional appeals, those unique Trump-era media dynamics described in the sources, what does it really mean for a potential successor to carry the Trump legacy?
Yeah, can you actually inherit a movement that seems so profoundly tied to the personal charisma, the specific tactics of one individual? Is it transferable?
And looking forward, how might those core characteristics of Trumpism, the ones we've spent time unpacking, continue to shape American politics, regardless of who the standard bearer is in the next election or the one after that?
Right. What parts are truly tied just to Trump the man, and what parts represent these deeper currents in the electorate or maybe in the media environment that are likely to persist anyway?
Something to consider is how these different facets might interact, maybe even conflict, as the movement tries to become what Vance and Rubio called that work of a generation or a 20-year project. What really stands out to you from all this?